Thank you, Emily, and greetings to members and guests. Welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices for Maximizing Relationships with Elected Officials. As Emily said, I'm Josh Hollingsy. I head the Transylvania Economic Alliance in Brevard and chair NCEDA's Professional Development Committee, and it's my duty to kick things off with our moderated panel today. Successful economic development draws from many sectors and taps many sources of support. Primary among the cast of characters are elected officials. From city council through U.S. Congress, support from public officers, holders can make or break opportunities. In some cases, they approve our budgets. In other instances, they can free up hidden project resources or eliminate unneeded obstacles. Relationships among economic developers and elected officials may be symbiotic, but they're far from simple. Small gestures can produce big results. Minor missteps can create major headaches. Luckily, we've got three experts on hand to guide us. Before we get to them, let's thank our sponsors. Watch your screen right now as we scroll through the names and logos of our annual sponsors. These companies and organizations stand with NCEDA and its mission year-round, and our sincere appreciation goes out to all of our annual sponsors. In developing relationships with elected officials at the municipal, county, state, and federal levels, it's often a good idea to start with shared understanding of the value, as well as the limits of what economic developers do, or sometimes don't do. With us today are three people who forged these kind of partnerships. Charles Hayes is managing partner of Hayes Group Consulting, a strategy, management, and advocacy organization that focuses on economic and community development. Prior to that, he was president and CEO of the Research Triangle Regional Partnership for 2 decades. He worked with hosts of local, state, and federal officials, and even some foreign political leaders. Anyone who's taken the basic economic development course at UNC Chapel Hill is no stranger to Jonathan Morgan. Jonathan advises public officials and conducts research on economic development at the UNC School of Government. He's also been a consultant at Regional Technology Strategies and Director of Economic Policy and Research for the North Carolina Department of Commerce and Research and Policy, and he's been a Research and Policy Director at the North Carolina Institute of Minority Economic Development. Finally, we have Dan Parks, a Senior Strategist with the Hayes Group Consulting. Dan's expertise in economic development and business strategy was developed over the course of 3-decade-long career consulting with economic development organizations, higher ed institutions, government agencies, and the banking industry, corporate sector, and small to mid-sized companies. Among his role with the SPTDC was the Senior Director for the Office of Outreach and Engagement. We've prepared some questions for each of our panelists and welcome our attendees to submit questions via the Q&A box at any time during our moderated discussion. Now let's get started. I'll start with you, Jonathan, with hopefully an easy answer, and that's a loaded question. Where does economic development as an issue fit on the spectrum of critical issues elected officials routinely have to deal with?
Thank you, Josh, and that is an important question, and I would say that the priority that jurisdictions place on economic development will vary from community to community. There's some places that put the resources into economic development that make it a priority, make it a larger priority than it might be in some other jurisdictions. But the point of the question, I think, is important, that economic development is one of many complex issues that elected officials have to tackle. And I would say in the communities and jurisdictions where economic development is a priority, elected officials are absolutely instrumental in the governance of economic development programs. They make decisions about budgetary allocations, organizational structure, and staffing that shape the capacity and direction of the economic development program. Local elected boards also determine how to prioritize public spending on what I call the building blocks of development, if you will. Things such as education, infrastructure, the community amenities that are in many ways, the prerequisites for economic development success. Local elected officials also set a jurisdiction's policy with respect to development incentives, and of course must vote to either accept or reject, approve or reject those requests for incentives on individual projects. And so that's an important role. And so it's important that professional economic development staff have an effective and good working relationship with local elected officials. And that requires a mutual understanding of the respective roles and responsibilities that staff play relative to elected officials. And effective communication is something that is an important, indispensable part of relationship building and interactions with elected officials. And we'll probably talk more about that later in the webinar.
And that's great. And I think that leads me into my next question directed to Charles. And specifically, what are some common misperceptions that elected officials come into office with regarding economic development issues and priorities? And are there ways that economic developers can help correct those misperceptions? Charles, you're on mute.
That's the word. That's the word of this COVID. You're on mute. I think that thank you, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I think the most common misconception is that economic development's easy. Anybody can do it, and all you guys or girls do is waste money and ride around the world, going to expensive lunches, and where's my target anyway? So I think that's the largest misconception. Experience has shown me on numerous occasions that I've personally been involved in with people that came in to the Economic Development Board of Directors, wherever community it may be in, with the sole purpose of shutting it down, because all they did was make my taxes go up and waste money. And in every case, once they learned what was done and how the process was done and how important it was, they were often, well, not every time, they were our biggest cheerleader. So I think the way you correct that misconception is through education, through really teaching people what economic development is, what it's not, and how you function and why it's important. But you have to understand that if you look at most elected officials, whether they are local, state, or national, most elected officials do not live in the same world developers do. They don't try the same places. They don't stay in the same hotels. They don't do the same things. And so it's very, very hard for them to understand why that is it is important. Now it's different and I'm talking too long because I know other people have stuff to say too, but it's different if you're talking to the business community. The business community typically gets it. So those places that have a public-private organization or a committee of 100 or they're totally private, that's a different deal. To give you one anecdote, one night I was working for a private company, economic development, and the client ordered a $200 bottle of wine. And I said, oh goodness, what in the world am I board and my chair going to say? So I told my chair the next day, boy, I tell you, this is what happened last night. They said, why are you telling me this, Charles? What's the deal? I said, it was the client, what the client wanted, what the client did. You're there to serve the client. I said, oh, okay. So there's a difference.
I think we've often been in those situations. Dan, somewhat related to that, you've worked in rural, urban, and suburban legislators and county commissioners. What are some of the hot buttons to consider when talking to politicians from different types of communities?
Well, thanks, Josh. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. Well, the first thing is the different types of communities that we encounter, and there are subsets of these, but we know that there's rural and urban. But in addition to that, there are communities on the rise and there are communities that are struggling. And those are different dynamics. And then there are Republican and Democrat-led communities and influence circles that we meet. But in terms of the hot buttons, the post-COVID world is really a hot button. How we're emerging and how we're planning to come through and really rebound, hopefully, in this post-COVID world, that's a hot button. Then further, somewhat universal is broadband. That's more prevalent in rural areas, as we know, but almost every group we talk with, broadband is an issue, infrastructure is an issue. When we're talking with elected officials, I think we're all mindful that we need to be listening and asking questions to determine, where they are and best ways to respond. And a lot of that is because as we encounter elected officials, and with many of us, there can be single issues as hot buttons. And we have to be very aware that somebody's single issue may be recruitment or small business or versus recruitment. It also might be education, healthcare, regulation, taxes, and we encounter that. One of the hot buttons that we have encountered, again, more in rural counties, is agriculture. Sometimes as economic developers, we unfortunately walk past agribusiness. And we've had some real strong reminders that the ag community is strong. So those are some hot buttons. I think the takeaway is to really have an understanding of our elected official and what might motivate them to really become more and more engaged with us in economic development.
Jonathan, on that same topic, is there a uniform advice on approaching all elected officials, or is it best to customize your interactions based on specific economic opportunities and political personalities?
Yeah, so I think there are some universal general principles in working with elected officials, such as ensuring that they're kept in the loop about the economic development program, and that they view themselves as being on the team rather than being an adversary. And of course, that comes about through effective communication in terms of program needs, challenges, and successes. However, that being said, each jurisdiction certainly is different, and the makeup of its elected board at any point in time will be different, and the nuance of each project is different. So economic developer interactions with elected officials will likely need to be calibrated to account for that variation, and in order to fit the specific circumstances of a particular economic development opportunity or project.
Charles, on the economic development is considered bipartisan endeavor, but does that mean it's wise to apply the same tactics when interacting with different political parties, Democrat, Republican, or Independent, on specific issues related to economic development?
So if the question is, should you treat everybody the same, the answer is yes, and also the answer is no. You should not, in my view, you should not treat anyone different because of their political party, because at the end of it all, at least what we're dealing with, they're all North Carolinians. And so they're North Carolinians. So you should treat everybody alike. Now, if I'm talking to someone that happens to be a Democrat, and that Democrat leans far right, I would talk to that person, would focus more on things that I would think they would be interested in. And if I was talking to a Republican that leaned far left, now I've just given you two examples that don't usually exist, but if I was talking, the point in that, you don't talk to people different because of their party affiliation. Somebody far right, though, when you're talking about economic development, you might say why it's going to return on investment. If we do this, this is the ROI we get. This is how we'll make our taxes lower. This is that. I'm broad brushing here, but if you're talking with someone that's far left, you might talk about how this is going to give opportunities for all people, how it will narrow the income gap, the wage gap, how it will bring a rising tide floats all boats, and those sorts of things. So there are things I think we have to be aware of. There are things that people are interested in, but I don't think that's necessarily because of party affiliation, but I think there are things that people are interested in that other people are not as interested in. Mm-hmm. And so yes, you talk to everybody the same about, I think Jonathan mentioned it earlier, that there are some basic truths that you talk about, but then why do we want to do economic development? Well, there's a whole wide range of things, and some people may be more interested in one of those ranges or areas than others. Did I answer your question?
You did, and I think that kind of takes us into a question I think I'll pose to the whole panel, and that really does kind of get at the heart of economic development, at least in my community where we're fairly small. We are rural. We have a vibrant tourism economy, but in terms of maybe traditional industrial recruitment, we're not that sort of community generally. And a lot of our elected officials are coming in very green to the economic development profession anyway. So I think my question is, for folks like me and others around the state, could you tell us a little bit more about the educational resources available to elected officials to learn more about economic development? And I know UNC has a great track record as well as ECU. So Jonathan, I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about some of your resources.
Sure, sure, happy to do that. The first obvious resource that I would mention is the North Carolina Economic Development Handbook that we did in collaboration with NCEDA. That publication has been a useful way to get a fairly user-friendly, easy to digest piece of information in the hands of local elected officials in particular, to help them understand how the process of economic development works in North Carolina. And we're in the process of thinking through how to update that publication, but most of what is in it is still very relevant today. And then the second resource available from UNC is the Essentials of Economic Development course that I developed several years ago, in large part in response to what I was hearing from economic developers about the gap in knowledge and understanding among their local elected officials in terms of economic development. And in all too many instances, there was a perception that the local elected officials were more of a hindrance than they were a supporter in many economic development projects. And so we offer that course. It's a one-day crash course that we've done in different regions of the state pre-COVID, when we could move around freely. In fact, one of the last ones we did before the pandemic, Charles Hayes participated in it and was an instructor. The one we did at Vance Granville Community College. But we've got a virtual offering of that Essentials of Economic Development course coming up on May the 13th. And so for any of you who have local elected officials who you think might benefit from it, encourage them to sign up through our website. And then the newest resource that literally we just finished producing is an online module focused on economic development tools and strategies that I did as a tag team with my colleague Tyler Mulligan. And it's a short 10 to 12 minute module that gets into greater detail in incentives and public-private partnerships for development. And so I think that's our primary set of offerings right now that I think would be most beneficial to elected officials, and that is designed with them in mind.
Charles, are you able to add to that on background on ECU as well?
I can. And everything Jonathan said is very important. And I would encourage everybody to participate in those opportunities as you have fit, as you see fit, or as you can. It was my observation over the many years in economic development that 99.9% of the people that were either elected or volunteer leaders in economic development got involved in that for the right reasons. They wanted to make their community better. And probably, I can't substantiate this, but it appears that about 80 to 85% of those had no clue about what economic development was. And so I pitched the idea to ECU to start an economic development academy that would have a focus. Part of the focus would be on providing education to elected and volunteer leaders, and part of it would be ended up being a continuing education for professional economic developers. The part that is for volunteer and elected leaders, we call the ECU Economic Development Honors Academy. And of course, we're doing this in conjunction with NCEDA, with a lot of leadership from NCEDA and direction from the chairs and board of directors to volunteers to Jonathan helped on some of the committees when we were first establishing this, as well as others did. And what we do is place-based economic development. It's a 4-hour seminar, and we do it at the place. And obviously, what we would teach in Pitt County would be different than what we would teach in Anson County. Some of the things are the same, but it's place-based. So it's place-based economic development, what it is, what it is not, what does triple helix mean, what are traded industries, traded clusters, just a common knowledge of what are some of the trends we're seeing globally and in economic development. And we've done about, I think, 14 or 15 counties now. And we've tried to do like one a month. But then we stopped at COVID. But last week, we did the first one we've done since February of 2020. And we did it in Chatham County. And that was a hybrid. We had some people in person, some people online. And next month, we're doing one, I think it's next month, in Stanley County. And we limit those seminars to 20 people. Now, I think one we had 23 or 24, and one we had 15 or 16. But we've done them in urban areas and rural areas and across the state. And it's been well received. But I mean, it's a continuing thing. As soon as you teach it, somebody else is elected, somebody else is volunteered. So, but anyway, and Dan teaches that. Dan and I have been the instructors for all of them except one, Gary Lanier, and I instructed one of them. But that's it. And we can provide you a list of the counties we've been in, and you can certainly contact the economic developers there to see what they thought. Because the way we do it, Josh, I would go see you. Say, hey, Josh, here's what we do. What do you think? And then you choose who goes to the meeting. That's the way we do it.
And Dan, piggybacking on that, is there, as you're teaching or in your background in consulting, is there one simple message that seems to work as a starting point on economic development conversations with elected officials?
Yes, there are some, Josh, some messages. Just to piggyback just for a moment on Charles' comments about the academy, as we come to a community, it actually ties into this question, Josh, because as elected officials typically are part of a seminar we would do on site, not the credentialing side that ECU does, but the honor seminar on site. Number of elected officials have attended the 14 or 15 we've done. We've had feedback from them. We've engaged them. The feedback from the elected officials includes we understand better what economic development is, and it helps us all potentially make better decisions. So better knowledge, better decisions. That's a big part of that common thread of what we're trying to engage. But in terms of a simple message, I thought about this and the engagements we've had, and here's a simple message. If I'm talking with an elected official, understanding more about economic development can allow you to show your constituents what you're actually doing for them. Show your constituents what you're actually doing for them. And a lot of times, if a county develops a strategic plan, say a board of commissioners develops a strategic plan, economic development will be a goal area, one of the pillars. So for the county commissioner, let's say, as an elected official, they develop messaging. They're able to demonstrate that action is underway. Another approach is economic development is really about your place and your future. If we get more personal, it's about our children and grandchildren. So those are some messages. And I think finally in this arena, it's about leadership and common ground. That's one message. If you're an elected official in terms of leading in economic development, and here's the major takeaway for us. Economic development has shown itself to be common ground between Republicans, Democrats, those other differences we were talking about, those polarities that we're experiencing right now. Economic development is more of a common ground, and where folks, let's say on a board, don't get along, don't trust each other, disagree, they can actually work together. And that's been the feedback. So the message of, this is a way to enhance what you can say to your constituents about what we're actually doing. And it's a way forward through this political polarity. We hope so.
Jonathan, on that same line of thinking, and I'm somewhat jealous of the relationships that you're able to form statewide, but then also I can imagine the different personalities when you're teaching elected officials about economic development. But is there a uniform advice on approaching elected officials? Is it best to really kind of hone in on their political personalities, or is there specific economic opportunities that you've tended to focus on?
Yeah, so I think we discussed this a little bit earlier, but I think that there's some general principles we can adopt that are useful in working and interacting with elected officials. And when it comes to partisan politics, my advice is to steer clear of the partisan fray as to the greatest extent possible, because when you think about it, there's virtually no upside to getting mired in the political squabbles, the hot button issues that a lot of politicians get caught up in, the extremes, the polarization. It's hard to see an upside for an economic developer to get in the middle of that political wrangling, partisan bickering. And the downside risk is substantial when you think about it. The risk to an economic developer's professional reputation and credibility is significant. So I would say in navigating the politics of the day, the partisanship, that whenever possible, it's better to leave that to the politicians themselves, and to really keep the focus on the economic development business, which by all accounts should be a nonpartisan undertaking. And so that's the additional piece that I would add to the earlier discussion we had about dealing with the nuance and different values of different elected board members, but also the different jurisdictions that value and prioritize different things.
In your work at the School of Government, one of the things I'm really interested in is, are there the most frequently asked questions? Are there topics that just seem to always resonate and come up in your discussions in the classroom?
Absolutely. And I've been on the faculty at the School of Government since 2003. So coming up on 21 years. And there are two questions that I have received very frequently from local elected officials, county commissioners, municipal city council folks. And the first is, Jonathan, tell me what the ideal structure is for our local economic development program. And that question, as Charles said earlier, because every 2 years the personalities on the board change due to the election outcomes. Every new board that gets constituted takes a look at the existing structure for local economic development, and in most cases they take issue with it. They think that it's broken and it needs to be fixed, and they want to put their stamp of approval on it. And so I get asked that a lot from the newly elected officials who think that there is a better way to structure the local economic development program. In some cases, economic development has been done totally in-house within local government, and they're interested in actually farming it out to a nonprofit or private organization. And so they want to explore that option. And in other instances, it's the exact opposite, where they've had a private nonprofit EDC and they don't, feel it's, up to snuff, and they want to take back control, direct control over the economic development program, bring it back in-house to local government. And then there's everything in between. And so the right answer to the question is that there is no one best way to structure economic development. What will be effective in one place may not work in another place. A lot of it depends on the details, on the nuance in every community. And then a lot of communities find that the structure that is most effective will change over time, and it needs to be flexible in that regard. But that's one of the questions that I get, this question about structure. And then the second one is inevitably about incentives, and specifically about what incentives can be offered to help support small businesses. There's just always this itch that local elected officials have about trying to do something to support small businesses. And because the incentives get offered to the large industries and the big corporations, they also think that there's got to be some way to structure an incentive for small businesses. And so that's the other common question that I've received over the years.
That's great. Charles, this will be a question to everybody, but can you describe, in your past experience, when a political figure either added or subtracted value from an economic development opportunity, and what you did to potentially rectify or leverage the opportunity?
I'm going to ask another question before I do that. I said that, and I agree with Jonathan 100%. You should not be involved in partisan politics in any way. But it's also it's a slippery slope we economic developers walk on. It's a fine line, whatever, thin ice, whatever you want to call it, because we are expected to be the experts in economic development, and we are expected to tell the truth. And the day after House Bill 2 passed, I was on a panel and about economic development, and a reporter from it doesn't matter where they were from asked a question. Nobody said anything about it. It just had passed the night before, but the question was, will HB2 hurt or help economic development? And I, without hesitation, said it'll hurt, and that's the truth. It did, but that's a slippery slope, because you just jumped into some mess there. And unfortunately, I'm lobbying for economic developers to have tenure. Then they can maybe speak more truth to power. But it's a slippery slope. We have to tell the truth. And to answer your question, Governor Luther Hodges, probably every governor, well, not probably, every governor since Luther Hodges has been a champion for economic development. So you can look at our governors, both Republican and Democrat, they have all been champions and very good at leading our state in moving it forward. And the history is rife with all of that. I guess if you had to say, everybody comes up with Hodges and Hunt, but Governor Holshouser is one of my favorite. He did so much great stuff too, but all of them, every one of them been good. So go look at a list. And if I wanted to see what economic development, what elected officials have done in a positive way, I would look at the governors of North Carolina since Luther Hodges. And the ones that have been negative, I think it's the ones that speak publicly and loudly about anti-incentives and some even anti-growth. We don't want to grow. We got enough, blah, 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 all that. And I don't have any, for instances of that.
That's excellent. Thank you. Dan, in your past experience and working with elected officials in your consulting world and advocacy role for economic development, do you have any specific times where elected officials or political figures have added or potentially subtracted from a particular opportunity?
I think it's probably easier to remember the times that they've added.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're mostly good intentions at work, and that's what we hope. If you're in a leadership role and you're really trying to, if you love your place, and that's the nice thing about economic development, that's sort of our starting point. It's about that place and that future and that community and so forth. I think where elected officials have really added to economic development is helping craft the message. Probably a step back from that is helping to put the vision in place. That's how they've really helped with economic development, because they, as a board, as a group, the elected officials can be diverse and therefore represent different aspects of the community. And clearly, focus groups and other things can be utilized in coming up with a vision. But I think that that's one of the ways that elected officials have really added to economic development, where it's situations where they have detracted from economic development is where they've been so caught up in their single issue. And that single issue might be taxes, or it might be incentives, or regulation, or it might be on the other side, that they lose something in their ability to collaborate. And one of the bits of feedback we get is just going through an economic development planning session as a body, as a board, can enhance collaboration. So I really think, Josh, most of the time we see the elected officials step up and add, but there are occasions where they detract.
That's great. I'm going to take a question from our audience now. And the question, it's a really good question. It says, should we reach out to elected officials before they become elected officials or during campaign and attempt to build a relationship before they enter office? Didn't know if any of you had any specific thoughts or experience in that realm.
Well, my thought would be, and the key word is reach out. If anybody approaches you, of course, give them whatever they want, and whether you should reach out, it probably would be good. They need to be educated, but you need to make sure you reach out equally. And that may be difficult to do. So that's some more of that slippery slope stuff.
Great advice. Thank you.
The feedback we've had from these seminars we do on site from elected officials, the newly elected officials, is that we wish we had known more about economic development. They will say at the end of our time, typically, this is really great, and here's what I learned, because we asked them, what were the learning points? And often they will say, gosh, I wish I'd known more about this earlier. So as Charles said, you have to probably pick and choose and be equal in our outreach. But I think the desire is there on their part to know more about economic development.
And kind of on that education part and trying to build relationships before they become before critical relationships, what resources do you find elected officials gravitate when evaluating economic development opportunities? And I know each of you kind of represent resources, so it could be the School of Government or ECU, but are there things that maybe local economic developers have access to that can help elected officials when they're evaluating economic development opportunities? Charles, I don't know if you want to start.
Josh, when you say economic development opportunities, do you mean an opportunity to recruit a business, grow a business, or you mean opportunities? What does that mean? I don't understand the question.
Yeah, I think it means when they're evaluating a specific project, are there specific tools that you find that elected officials really want or gravitate towards that you might be familiar with?
Return on investment. How you can do your return on investment, whether that's hiring an outside consultant to do it, whether you do it internally. But that's what they all want to know. Why are we doing this? What's going to be the outcome? What's the predictions, and how do you do that? One of the ways that, unfortunately, that they seek to get the information is from their constituents. And I say unfortunate because, I mean, why wouldn't you want them to listen to the constituents? Well, because the constituents don't know what they're talking about very often. And I don't mean that ugly. I mean, I'm ignorant just about lots of things. I can't rebuild a transmission. There are a lot, and they just don't know, but they listen to that. And so education, and a lot of folks, they don't trust they don't trust the people like you have on this panel. Oh, they're a bunch of daggum, they're going to tell you, that they don't trust them. So it's very, very difficult. So, but the ROI, the return on investment, a non-interested party that can look at something and say, if you do this, this is a likely outcome. If you can find that, that's what I'd recommend doing.
And Josh, I think there's a dynamic we've missed as we've had our conversation, and that is the dynamic of regional economic development. A lot of the elected officials are more, let's say, parochial, or they're more locally based, a municipality or a county. So a lot of times we're talking about county, let's say, county economic development. The resource that a commissioner usually turns to early is the county manager. So the county manager, and this goes back to what Jonathan was talking about earlier, what's the structure of economic development? But a lot of times, no matter what the structure, the county manager's in the middle of it. But what we're seeing more and more is the dynamic of regional economic development, and those locally elected folks are collaborating. And we're seeing counties come together in ad hoc kinds of relationships. It might be around the aviation aerospace corridor or North Carolina manufacturing core, so that dynamic of regional economic development has an impact on where an official will seek resources. But a lot of times it's within the county and the county manager and others, but increasingly beyond to the region.
That's great feedback. And I think building into that, and as we come to a close, I think one of the last questions that I have, and unless we've got folks in the chat and trying to monitor the Q&A, and this is more open-ended, but what one piece of advice would you give economic development staff when striving to assist elected officials and governments represent more effective. So what one piece of advice would you give an economic developer as they strive to assist an elected official? Jonathan, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, and I want to also quickly respond to an earlier question, back to the one on how experiences or instances where elected officials may have added or subtracted from an economic development opportunity. And I agree with Charles and Dan that generally, in most cases, elected officials are well-intended and want to be supportive and do the right thing by economic development. But there are instances where, and they're rare, I would say, where elected officials make a decision to speak out in ways that aren't helpful, and I won't mention any specific instance, though I've heard several horror stories over the years, not only in North Carolina but in other states as well. And so what I'll do is mention the problem areas that can pop up when elected officials do something that might jeopardize an economic development opportunity. And one is breaches of confidentiality breaches. And there's probably no better way to squash an opportunity or project than doing that. And another potential distraction occurs when elected officials demonstrate undue strife, animus, and infighting when conducting the business of government. And it's important to remind elected officials that prospective businesses may be tuning in to watch board meetings and to be mindful of how those proceedings are perceived by would-be corporate investors and their site selection consultants. So I just wanted to weigh in on that question. And then in terms of my parting final advice to everyone who's joined in today about how best to work with elected officials, my advice would be to be humble yet persistent in working to educate your local elected officials to help them understand the economic development process and specifically their role in supporting and advancing those efforts. Be proactive and candid in dealing with them, and try to be as transparent as possible whenever you can. I think the key takeaway from my perspective from today's discussion is to get your elected officials on the team and show them what needs to be done to score some wins for the community. That would be my final advice.
Great advice. Charles, can you have any specific comments on that one piece of advice?
Well, I was thinking as Jonathan was going through that, and I said, gosh, I hope Josh doesn't call on me for Jonathan. But one thing I would say, don't apologize for what you do. I have seen occasionally when asked, like, well, why did you stay at that hotel? Or why did you do this? Or why did you do that? Well, you did it because you thought that was the best thing to do. You didn't do it to waste money. You didn't do it. You thought that was best. And so don't apologize for what you do. So in other words, said another way, don't do anything for which you would have to apologize.
That's great advice for anybody. I like
quickly,
that.
Josh, I think a lot of our elected officials and board members and other folks of influence are business industry folks. And one of the conversations we often have during our seminars is what's the actual work of the Economic Development Office? What does it do? And basically communicating, if I'm an economic developer, I'm running my office like a business. I'm running my office like a business in a similar way you might run your business. And here's what we do. Here are the roles, and here's how we allocate resources. And typically, economic development offices are strained in terms of resources with a lot of expectations. So how to really get that bit of advice to really communicate that the Economic Development Office is being run like a business.
Perfect advice. Thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate that. And that's the last question that I had. And unless one of our panelists had something else that they wanted to bring up. But I think we're closing in on our window of time, and want to thank Dan and Jonathan and Charles for their participation and their insightful and valuable discussion. We are very appreciative of their involvement, and specific their partnership with NCEDA and trying to advance the profession and advance communities throughout North Carolina. So thank you all for your time today.
And thank you for asking us. It was a lot of fun. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Wish we could have done it in person.
One day soon, hopefully we'll be able to do that. Again, thank you guys, and appreciate NCEDA's annual sponsors. And I'll close this out with a few little updates from our organization and upcoming events. We'll be hosting the Emerging Executives Virtual Happy Hour later this week on Thursday, April 29th from 4 to 5. If you're a younger professional or newer to economic development, be sure to register for this networking opportunity. And another in-person attendance at our annual conference on June 8th through 10th is currently at capacity, but we'll also be offering a virtual option to participate, and we hope that you will consider that. We also hope to open a few more registration slots as we get into May. If you're interested in being added to our wait list for in-person attendance, please send an email to Liz. Whether you're joining face-to-face or online, we look forward to getting caught up with everyone at that important gathering. So thank you very much. Thank you, NCEDA staff, for all that you do. And to our one last thank you to our panelists. Thank you.